Welcome to DBC. Today we are continuing with Talks to Charity, and we're heading into the real center of the book today. We'll begin with chapter 5, which is called Beyond Us-Based Giving, which is a deeper look into what the author calls the compassion business. And this is asking and answering the question of who benefits from this. And he notes that coming from a church background, a lot of churches, a lot of times, it's the church members themselves that seem to have this sort of benefit of feeling good about what they're doing, more so than the people that they're supposed to be serving. And in both senses, there's like this short-term sort of benefit for the church members and a short-term sort of benefit for the people that they're serving. And there's not really a long-term view of it. And he gives a bunch of case histories of different churches about serving others versus the people that are being served part of the community too. Is this sort of otherness going on still? And that there are no quick fixes. And then there's this big case study given of what he calls top-down charity, which the story starts that there was the Carter Center in Atlanta that was named after Jimmy Carter, that a man froze to death, like just within sight of it. And Jimmy Carter read this story and was very affected by it personally and took on this large program called the Atlanta Project, or TAP, T-A-P for short. And the mission of TAP was to help urban communities gain access to the resources they need to solve the problems that most concern them. And this was all leading up to the Olympics in Atlanta in '96. Long story short, they spent a ton of money and had problems districting different neighborhoods. They sort of drew lines based on school districts and not the communities that were actually present in Atlanta. And just an interesting quote that after the end of it, what they said, according to TAP themselves, what TAP has done is come to understand that community involvement is a critical component in achieving true empowerment for people. The community must be empowered to act, initiate, make decisions, and respond. $34 million, that's what they got. I want to read the first part of that again. What TAP has done is come to understand that community involvement is critical. So what they've done is come to understand. There wasn't really a doing there. It's more of what they've learned. And it seemed to be a lot of money. And there's a bunch more talking about kind of more of the same stuff. And then as we move into chapter 7, actually, which is called Wise Giving, where we get some kind of new content, not just stories of things that we've already talked about. And this starts with a summit that was held by Bill, Melinda Gates, and their buddy Warren Buffett. And they had a Q&A. This is when Warren Buffett announced that he was donating his, I think at the time it was like $60 billion to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And the questions that were most asked were like, how do you give wisely and how much do you give to your children? Those are the two questions that kept coming up. And those two questions are connected. They're not, so you could say, how do you give wisely to people you don't know? And how do you give wisely to people you do know? Your children being one group of that. And there's a great quote from Buffett, and he says, it's much easier to make money than to give it away intelligently. I thought that was a pretty cool insight from him. And he's an investor, and Bill Gates is a businessman, obviously, and so they want to think of nonprofit sector as more of a business, and to really look at like R&D, for example, was never really done in the nonprofit space. Looking at return on investment, passion that drives people, relief versus development, again, this initial versus long-term picture, and then invest in cutting-edge technologies and business. So Buffett says when we ask these questions, we should always take the long view and say, like, well, what's this organization going to look like in 10 years or in 50 years? To take a long view as opposed to just like, how can we stop the bleeding right now? And he says sort of a few questions he asks to say, are we doing good things or not? So are the recipients assuming greater levels of control over their own lives? Is there leadership emerging amongst those who are being served? And are there aspirations that are rising? As well as what is the trajectory, the long-term, sort of where are we going in 10, 20, 50, 100 years? And then there's this metaphor at the end of the chapter that the section is called Controlling the Lake. And we all know the image, or the metaphor of if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach him to fish, you feed him for life. And he says, well, like, what about, it's called controlling the lake. So who controls the lake? And gaining control of a lake or a fish source is a community issue. So controlling the lake implies ownership by the community of their own community, not this sort of outside top-down model of like the Jimmy Carter sort of the Atlanta Project model. So teach people to fish and thrive. And so they go to Central America a lot in this section. In Nicaragua, they talk about 3 steps: going to observe and listen, being steps 1 and 2, and then to ask questions and having a sense of curiosity along with entrepreneurship. And we've mentioned microlending a little bit before. We come back to it here really in a big way. So controlling the lake means that instead of, this is a big key way of looking at things differently. Controlling the lake means that instead of seeing the neighborhood as something that the lucky and the fortunate get to escape from, that it's something that workers and recipients see as full of resources that can be exploited for the benefit of the residents themselves. And so asking like, who owns the lake? And in this sense, who owns the land? Let's say it's a bad neighborhood. Who owns that crack house? Who owns the abandoned warehouse? Who owns the parking lot that's never used, just full of trash? And then this also requires a belief on the side of the residents, and to connect the dreamers and the people that are in the community that believe with the resources to provide them with the means to fulfill their dreams. And this is where we come back to microlending. And Muhammad Yunus, you guys can look him up if you haven't heard much about him. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006. He's from Bangladesh, and for his work with microlending, which is small loans that are really community-based and used as an entrepreneurial to help people who are poor in the world to grow their own business. But most people in the world that are poor, most businesses there are people that are self-employed, where they own their own job or their own business, and they don't work for an employer like in the U.S. So the idea here is that the trouble is that the poor in the world do not have traditional tangible assets to serve as collateral for a loan. So what they do is they form trust groups, and this is back to Nicaragua again. So there's this sort of community and accountability within the group that people, because it's their community, they're not going to bail on each other. So it can be used not only to expand businesses, but also for community development. So in Nicaragua, there are projects where like the fishermen wanted to build a pier, which would help them with their fishing, but also help bring tourists to their region to have something to do there, as well as having libraries or book exchanges and a community oven for bakers that they could use economies of scale to produce bread at a lower price. And then there's this idea of like, well, why don't we hear about microlending in the U.S.? It's always in the third or developing world. And the idea is that there's 3 things that need to happen for microlending to work, and that they aren't really found in the U.S. Number 1 is an ingrained work ethic. We don't have that as much here. An entrepreneurial instinct, which we do have, but then there's a stable support system, which is their code word for the family. And they talk about the levels of intact mother, father, offspring, nuclear families existing in poor environments, and the rates have dropped drastically. And for that reason, that's why microlending doesn't work, because of this support system that's socially not really there in the U.S. They say that we're not as hungry. There are many legal barriers to micro business in the U.S. as far as permitting and taxes that don't exist in the third world, and no family support in the urban environments. And back to Nicaragua real quick. The idea here is to create community and business opportunities that allow even the poorest people to participate with dignity. So talk about like repairing roofs so they don't be wet, so that there's not mud inside the houses when it rains. And they said even the poor people can't even afford the microlending. So they said, okay, well, we'll just do it piece by piece so they can afford, let's just put a cover, there's like these corrugated metal that they're buying. Let's just put that over the wettest part of the house, and they can pay that off in a year, and then we'll just work slowly. So this idea that the poorest can participate with dignity through interacting and transacting, as opposed to having a handout and receiving and going on with that. We will continue with the end of talks starting next time. Thank you again for watching.